Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. The seventh round of talks between the United States and Afghan Taliban begins Saturday, which is tomorrow, in Qatar's capital of Doha. Negotiators on both sides have been trying since October 2018 to hammer out a deal to end the 18-year-long war. The upcoming round will focus on working out a timeline for the withdrawal of US-led troops from Afghanistan and on a Taliban guarantee that militants won't plot attacks against the US or its allies from the Afghan soil. What comes first has been the sticking point so far. The Taliban have insisted that the US announce a withdrawal timeline before the talks can proceed to the next round. The US wants the Taliban guarantees to come simultaneously with any announcement for the withdrawal of foreign forces. It seems, however, that there might be a better chance of bridging these positions, with the Taliban spokesperson Sohail Shaheen saying, and I quote, "We don't need to wait for the completion of the withdrawal. Both withdrawal and talks can move forward simultaneously." He also added, once the timetable for foreign force withdrawal is announced, then talks will automatically enter the next stage. In March, a draft agreement was reached on the withdrawal of foreign forces in exchange for a commitment by the Taliban to cut ties with militant groups such as Al-Qaeda. A Taliban source said both sides were expecting some clarity and results on the prime issues in the new round talks. Two other main issues in the process are a ceasefire and talks between the rival Afghan sides, the Taliban, and the Western-backed government in Kabul. So far, the Taliban have refused to do either or both. Meanwhile, the Afghan President Ashraf Ghani arrived in Pakistan yesterday and also visited Lahore today. This is Ghani's third visit to Pakistan since his election in 2014 and comes at a tense time for relations between the two countries, with Ghani earlier accusing Pakistan of interference in internal political affairs and with the Afghan peace process gathering steam, from which his government has been excluded so far, much to his chagrin. Last week, the Lahore Center for Peace Research hosted a major conference for Afghan opposition leaders in the hill town of Bourbon, with Pakistani Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi saying trust needed to be rebuilt between the two countries. Before Ghani's visit, an Afghan presidential spokesperson said the visit would focus on Pakistan's role in achieving peace in Afghanistan. It is important to see how much regional countries such as Pakistan are ready and what kind of help it can provide for peace in Afghanistan, he said. Where exactly does the situation stand? Is there likely to be a breakthrough in Doha? Was Ghani here to get Pakistan to pressure the Taliban into talking to his government? Are Taliban amenable to such pressure from Pakistan? Questions abound. And to try to get some answers, we are joined by Mariam Wardak, who is an analyst and peace activist. She joins us from Dubai. Dr. Moeed Yusuf, who is Associate Vice President, Asia Center at the USIP. We also have Ambassador Shamshad Ahmad Khan, who was Pakistan's former Foreign Secretary. David Sidney, who was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia and also for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia in two different tenures. And we have Ambassador Mathew Bryza, who joins us from Istanbul. Ambassador Khan, if I might begin with you, because you had arranged that Bourbon conference, which is part of the Lahore process. How did this come about, and what exactly were the objectives?
The first clarification, Bourbon event had nothing to do with President Ashraf Ghani's visit to Pakistan. It was purely a track 2 event, and the Lahore Center for Peace Research that I represent, we were trying to get the Afghan leaders of different thinking from across the Afghan political canvas board. But we were at a loss for quite some time, because since last year I was trying to arrange this event. Finally, then I had to seek my government's help, and we were able to get hold of about 57 political leaders.
From Afghanistan, that's a large number.
Representing about 13 or 14 major political parties and groups. And another clarification that it was not a dialogue between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Essentially, it was meant to be an intra-Afghan dialogue. My center had only provided a unique platform to Afghan leaders to come here and in an open atmosphere share their views with each other. The overarching theme was Afghan peace, the way forward. So they discussed a whole lot of...
It got a lot of traction in the international media. In fact, some of the stories said that Pakistan had arranged this conference. So,
well, obviously, my center is Pakistani center.
I mean, in the sense that the implication was that it was the government of Pakistan.
You are familiar with the track 2 processes. I have been associated with many track 2s on India. You remember we have been together with Moeed. So this was another track 2 in the context of Afghan crisis. And it has served a great purpose, I must say, because these groups and political parties were those which are not currently part of any ongoing peace process. Because now the United States is talking to Taliban. The Russians are talking to both government in Kabul and Taliban. The Chinese are also doing the same thing. The Europeans are doing the same thing. Most of these leaders and groups were not involved in any of these processes. So we provided them an opportunity to get together and discuss the whole...
I will get back to what the format of the conference was, because you said that this was an intra-Afghan dialogue. But let me hop over to David Sidney, who is in Kabul. David, obviously as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia, you've been involved in most of these processes. What is your sense of what can happen this time when the 7th round begins tomorrow in Doha?
Well, progress has certainly been slower in Doha than many people hoped, but the important news is that the talks are continuing and that both sides are signaling that they want progress. This is all, of course, in the context of the very clear message from Ambassador Khalilzad, the U.S. representative, that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So if the Taliban and the U.S. are to reach agreement on some kind of timetable and some kind of an agreement on Taliban ceasing support for terrorism, there still has to be a ceasefire, number one, and an intra-Afghan dialogue. The most important issue of all is the ceasefire. The situation on the ground remains quite violent. There are differing reports about what's happening on the ground. Apparently yesterday at the NATO defense ministers, Afghan Defense Minister Abdullah Khalid briefed that the Taliban spring offensive is failing and that the Afghan forces are making some significant advances in retaking areas the Taliban had taken before. So all of this is happening at the same time. Well, I said that the most important thing is the talks are proceeding. It's very positive that both sides are saying they expect progress in this round. While the talks have gone on and been harder than many people expected, others, in fact, I would say the majority of analysts expected them to be very tough and to go on this way. But the most important thing is the talks are continuing. And they're continuing in the context, as Ambassador Khalilzad has made clear, that all four elements, an intra-Afghan dialogue and agreement on a comprehensive ceasefire, have to be in place before any of them is acted upon. So therefore, the fact that the Taliban and the U.S. may be moving towards agreement is very positive. But the real key question for the Taliban is, do they agree to a comprehensive ceasefire? That is the single most important part of these talks. Now, yesterday, according to news reports, the Afghan Defense Minister, Abdullah Khalid, briefed NATO defense ministers that Afghan forces have defeated, in many ways, the Taliban spring offensive, and that Afghan forces have taken back a number of areas that the Taliban had held for almost a year. That new pressure on the Taliban may be what is making them more willing to move forward on areas where they've been hardline before. So there's a lot of things going on. But from here in Kabul, where I am now, I can tell you what Afghans want is peace. They want an end to the violence. The issues of truth withdrawal, what the Taliban say or don't say, are all secondary. An end to the war, peace, is what Afghans are very clearly saying they want.
Absolutely. Let me go to Ambassador Bryza here. Ambassador Bryza, what do you make of this? Of particular interest to me is what Sohail Shaheen said about the fact that the two things can move simultaneously. Do you think there's that nuance here whereby we could possibly expect that something will come out of this round and the 8th round would be, of course, a step forward from where we are as of now?
Yeah, I mean, as David Sedney, my old friend, was just saying, there is some reason for optimism of some progress, and Ambassador Khalilzad, as is always the case, is not pessimistic. But there's a huge problem out there potentially, and it was also embedded in what David Sedney said, which is if this agreement about a U.S. troop pullout in exchange for a pledge by the Taliban not to allow Afghanistan again to become a platform for terrorism, if it's reached, there still is this huge question mark hanging over the whole process and in President Ghani's mind about whether or not the rest of the four pieces are going to come together, meaning the comprehensive ceasefire and then some sort of a political agreement between the Taliban and the Afghani government. Now, that's a critical issue that involves the timing of the U.S. withdrawal, because you can imagine if all those steps haven't happened and if the political agreement is not implemented and U.S. troops leave, there's a lot of reason to believe things will likely go off the rails again, and we'll see chaos again in Afghanistan. President Trump is eager to pull out U.S. troops. He surprised everybody, including his defense secretary, who resigned when he unilaterally decided the U.S. was going to pull out of Syria its troops and was going to cut its forces in Afghanistan. And then he was walked back by his own government. So the point is, President Trump is eager to get those troops out. And if they go before that political agreement is implemented, things could get difficult. And actually what's being talked about now, I think, is that the U.S. troops would leave as long as the Taliban and Afghan government are simply talking to each other before they've even reached an agreement. That seems very dangerous to me.
Absolutely. Moeed Yusuf, USIP has been involved with this. You've also been looking at it from the Pugwash framework. And then you compiled that, that edited volume about insurgencies and, the track record of insurgencies and all that. Now, ceasefire is very important. But the insurgent force, especially if it's not losing, would prefer to jaw and war until there's a breakthrough. And in this particular case, Taliban's insistence on the U.S. actually giving a withdrawal timeline is something which is important, because that's what they're going to sell to their fighters in the field. So what are your expectations for this 7th round? And by the way, we are not coming to the political settlement issue at the moment, which Ambassador Bryza talked about, but we will. But let's first get to this.
Look, if the US wants a deal, there'll be a deal. Simple as that. Because it's the Taliban that are actually holding out, making the demands that they're making right now. If you look at where we started, it's very interesting. Actually, the US has conceded on big issues. The Guantanamo Bay prisoners, on the fact that US and Taliban would talk directly. You remember that the US had taken this line that you need to talk to the Afghan government. We are not going to talk to you directly. That's changed. They've been actually encouraging a direct conversation, but finding different ways to get the intra-Afghan dialogue going. So it's the Taliban actually who've held out. And there are two reasons for that. One, in the hearts of hearts, I think they believe that sooner or later, the US president will pull the trigger and call his troops home. And second, rightly or wrongly, they believe that they're ascendant and they actually can hold out and win this in any case. And so I think if the US compromises further and says, okay, fine, we're going to give you a timeline, and that's the timeline we're going to withdraw, and all you need to do is put something out that you're not going to work with Al-Qaeda or any other terrorist organization, that's it, you'll have a deal. I have a problem with that. And the problem is that everybody is talking about a dotted line on which people are going to sign. That's irrelevant to me. If you remember, there's the conversation exactly 20 years ago about the Geneva Accords. I mean, Shamshad Sahib and others were in office at that time. We had Geneva Accords. Very comprehensive. Go and look at it, and it says all the right things. And 3 years later, Afghanistan was hell. So, deal is not the end point for me. We can get a deal tomorrow, right? The issue is that process and is that deal sustainable?
So that takes us to what Ambassador Bryza said about the political settlement. And since he has to leave, I'll just go back to him to get his final thoughts on this. Ambassador Bryza, Geneva Accords, very comprehensive, the rest of it, 3 years down the line, the jig is up. So that to me is, of course, once again, that's the point which is crucial to this.
Yeah, I think that's completely the point. And as we just heard, right? I mean, the Taliban thinks it's going to be able to ride out the U.S. troop presence. Everyone in the world knows that President Trump is eager to bring the troops out. I recall back when in the Obama administration, when the decision was suddenly taken, or when President Obama said the U.S. troops would be out by a date certain, exactly the same thing happened. And the focus of all the U.S. diplomatic effort was no longer on trying to broker a lasting settlement, but it was just on the logistics of getting out. And so I think that's an absolutely logical consequence in Afghanistan if the one there that was providing a sense of a platform for the start of security, at least the beginning of security, and is the most influential actor in the world, hopefully, is leaving. I don't see how there can be a brokering of a deal by anybody. So it's pessimistic situation.
I think that's a very insightful point. Thank you so much, Ambassador Bryza, for speaking with us. But let me, since I have the only Afghan on the panelist who's been very patiently listening to the Americans and the Pakistanis, so I need to go to her to get her take on this. Mariam, A, what's your take on the 7th round that's going to start tomorrow? And B, what's your take on President Ghani's Pakistan visit?
Well, I agree partially with all of my colleagues here, and I believe that it's good that the two countries are talking again at a high level, offering the hope of a thaw in the frosty relationship. Of course, a full détente between the two sides will never be possible until peace is achieved in Afghanistan. And I think this platform, especially panels such as yours, are really important by providing suggestions to governments instead of more analysis, because we're all observing and providing our feedback. We're providing our observation, but when it comes to feedback, I think this is something that's crucial that policymakers need to drill in government's minds. We have President Ghani, who is on the 3rd trip to Pakistan. However, some of his advisors and some of his colleagues are tweeting that as if it was nothing that he intended to, but it was because it was a mandate from the Loya Jirga. The fact that the people want Afghanistan and Pakistan to start communicating so there can be some sort of a more progressive relationship, I think that's a positive sign. What I'm seeing now on their form of communication and how they're communicating with the Americans straight on, that they're behaving as a separate, independent agent, and that there are a political entity that will stand strong. And I believe that the agreement is not going to matter. I think that the Taliban have changed, and I also think that the Afghan people have changed. So the Taliban of 1990s are not going to behave as they had been, and I don't think that the public will accept what they had accepted back then as well. So I think that everybody is so focused on the details, and yes, I don't think anybody will follow, not even now is anybody following the rules and regulations in Afghanistan.
Absolutely.
So that is a concern of mine.
Now, let me ask you another question, because in this entire thing about Afghanistan and the regional country and also the US Taliban talks, we tend to forget that the current government in Kabul at various levels can be pretty dysfunctional, A. And secondly, within Afghanistan, there are lots of tensions among various players. There were close aides of President Ghani who have broken away, who are now contesting against him. Similarly, other opposition leaders, some of them, led by Mr. Hamid Karzai, the former president, are not particularly happy with the way things are happening in Afghanistan. So can you, since you know the internal dynamics, can you give us a sense of what the situation is?
Listen, President Ghani was voted in with, I think, about 3 to 4 million. The Afghan population is from 34 to 35 million. So it's not the whole population that has voted him in. So I think that there is a major breakage amongst the people. And we don't even understand how the population of what the Taliban consists in Afghanistan. I don't think that everybody is, and I think with one of the great things that the U.S. is pushing the intra-Afghan dialogue, because this is not supposed to be a government-led peace process. This needs to be an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned peace process. And an intra-Afghan dialogue is really important because everyone needs to get involved. And not everybody is involved in the democratic process. I mean, they're just about to close the registration for voting for elections, and they haven't had more than 3-4 million people again register. So yes, there is a fracture. I think a lot of people don't really participate in the democratic process, and they're more accustomed to the jigras and following what the elders say. And I think that peace, what Sydney mentioned earlier, is that peace is so crucial. People are exhausted. They don't want to fight. They're living in fear. The Afghan government, unfortunately, is fighting insurgency, but at the same side, they're fighting criminal activity. I mean, there's theft. There is murder. How many murders? Just last week, we had the head of the Sports Federation killed. A few weeks ago, we had a female journalist shot in broad daylight. I mean, the criminal activity is on the rise. So I think everybody is just living in fear, and it's the same fear that was during the Civil War. So I think that they're all just tired, and one of the things that everyone agrees is peace. Now, the question is this peace going to be at the cost of the freedom that everybody has now obtained? We don't know. This is something that the Afghans have to talk to one another and negotiate. Negotiation is not only with the Taliban. The Taliban cannot be the only ones that are going to be negotiating. The Afghan people also need to give up and be flexible on certain things if they want peace to happen. I hope that helps.
Okay. Thank you so much. That's Mariam Wardak speaking with us. David Sidney, that's an important thing. I mean, if there's so much of exhaustion, and of course, the clear indications that there is, then it's about whose will can last. And if the Taliban are less exhausted, then I believe that this whole idea of getting them to cease fire or not harden their position would probably be putting a lot of optimism and being very optimistic.
Well, I'll take a little different view than Mariam Wardak did. Well, I think we both agree the Afghan people want peace and the Afghans are exhausted. But it's not just the Taliban are exhausted as well. When the 3-day ceasefire happened a little over a year ago, Taliban welcomed that just as much as any other Afghans did. So that desire for peace, I think, is among all Afghans, including the Taliban. I think the situation regarding President Ghani is a little different, at least from my perspective. President Ghani, over the last year, has appointed a number of new, younger leaders. The current security ministers, Minister of Interior, Minister of Defense, are, in my view, among the very best, probably the best setup for security ministries that the Afghan government has had over the last 15 years. It's taken a long time to get there. A lot of young people are moving in. If you look at, for example, that thing that happened in Lahore that one of the earlier speakers talked about, almost everybody in there was an old man. But most Afghans are actually young. The Afghan population is, I think, something like 75% under the age of 25. It really is time for a new generation of Afghans to come to the lead, not just in Kabul, but also with the Taliban.
I think that was the point that Mariam was also making in terms of the Taliban having changed from the 90s, but also the Afghan population having changed, and they're probably not going to accept what the Taliban meted out to them in the 90s. But thank you so much, David Sidney, for being. Now we are back to the studios. Shamshad Saab, let me ask you, What was the format of this intra-Afghan dialogue that you arranged, and what was it? What are the takeaways?
Well, as I said earlier, that this was supposed to be a non-government event. Although Pakistan government was involved in terms of logistics, because we just could not arrange any such track to event at this scale without governmental help. Security, accommodation, and the size of the participation. There were at least 70, 80 people that we were hosting at this small place, Bourbon PC. You are familiar with that place. So the format that we had originally planned was that I wanted the conference to be divided in 3 sessions, each to be moderated by seasoned diplomats, but somehow they were not available because we were late in notifying them. So I arranged the moderator within the time that was available to us. So we had those 3 sessions, but no governmental representative was part of the deliberation.
Except the keynote address by the foreign minister.
Foreign minister had to be there because the participants were of that level and dignitaries of category 1. So foreign ministers had to welcome them on behalf of the government to show them the respect that we have for Afghan leadership, no matter which group or party. So he extended a very warm welcome on behalf of the government of Pakistan. Not only that, the president of Pakistan hosted a banquet for them in the evening. And also, at the conclusion of the conference, we had the Saffron Minister, Shahryar Afridi, to make the concluding remarks. So after the 3rd session, so he did speak. As I said, again, the atmosphere was very friendly and very positive on the part of every participant. They all appreciated the effort. They, in fact, insisted that we should continue the process. Some of them even offered to host the next round in different places.
Was there a resolution at the end of it?
No. But again, because of this, the size and the kind of gathering there, because they were representing diverse groups and thought processes. So we had just decided that it will be an open discussion at the level of these participants. We did not even attempt
What were the main strands that you can possibly identify for us?
Well, the peace, Afghan-led, Afghan-owned peace, and
which, if you ask me, is a truism, but such a cliche now because everyone talks about it. Yeah.
But at the same time, there were participants who said that time has now come for all of them to rise above the narrowly based divisive tendencies, divides. So they do agree.
Okay, I'm going to take a short break, but at the end of the break, we'll continue with our discussion of the complexities that Ambassador Khan is talking about. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're discussing the Afghan situation, the 7th round of talks in Doha that begin tomorrow, Saturday. Also the visit of President Ghani, who was in Lahore earlier today. And the day before, he had his meetings in Islamabad with the Pakistani leadership. Moeed Yusuf, complexities, Afghan-led, Afghan-owned. Actually, we started this. I mean, this term, Afghan-led and Afghan-owned.
Because that's our policy.
Yes, that began with Pakistan, but it's been picked up by everyone. What are your fears? I mean, I know you've already talked about the Geneva Accord. You've already talked about that's where the tipping point is. Where does it go from there? But given the situation, which is to use the wicked situation framework, that's what the situation is. So how to move forward?
First, I want to make a couple of points because one hears this all the time. Afghans are exhausted, Afghans want peace, everybody wants peace. Which average Afghan said they wanted war when?
Okay.
Was the average Afghan doing 9/11? Was the average Pakistani, 70,000 of whom we've lost or have been maimed, they were asking for it? In the 80s was, this idea that Afghans are exhausted. They've been exhausted for as long as this post 9/11 business is going on. They have nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
All that's happened is Afghans and Pakistanis have died in the process. So, let's be clear about this. This ceasefire happened and then we found out, no, you should have known every single day, right? These are vested interests where the game has gone on and, various Afghan factions. The other thing is this idea that Afghans need to overcome their differences. Absolutely, who can disagree? But this is a polity that has been at war for 40 years. This is a polity that has a very bad track record of agreeing, promising in the most holiest of places, and then backtracking. So I'm not optimistic. I think the effort that Shamshad Saab has made is fantastic, but it actually says something very sad about what is happening in Afghanistan, which is that he had to take an initiative, bring those people to a country which most people in Afghanistan badmouth all the time, and try and make this effort to get them together. This doesn't tell me that they are actually at a place where they can overcome these differences. We should keep trying. That's what, a neighbor. But at this point, I think it's a race against a timeline. Somebody says that, the US is going to leave on September 1st. Somebody says it's going to happen this day. When you have that mindset, insurgencies wait out.
Correct.
That's what insurgencies do. It's just natural. If there is a deal, any insurgent group has to go to their fighters and say, we are striking a deal with the enemy. This is a very delicate moment for any insurgency. You can actually have factionalization. You can have people sort of say, well, what did we fight for? So the Taliban interest will be to write this out. Now, if that's not going to happen, and if there isn't, that urgency, then I think you are at a mutually hurting stalemate. I think you are at a point where the Taliban cannot run over Afghanistan. That's absolutely clear. And the coalition cannot win militarily. The Afghan National Security Forces have had more losses in the past year and a half than probably the last 10 years combined.
Correct.
And so they are in no position to do this on their own. That's why I talked about sustainability. Today you have a deal. The ANSF will disappear in no time if you don't have a sustainable arrangement. Second, nobody talks about this. You're going to have a deal. There's going to be a power sharing arrangement, whether it's going to be President Ghani or somebody else, whatever it is. Who's going to sustain Afghanistan's economy? Najibullah's government fell not because something else happened. It was when the Soviets the Russians pulled the money out, it was over, right? Who's going to pay the bill? Now, the US will pay some of it. The Europeans are in no position to actually do much. The only option available is connectivity with Pakistan, with China, with things that are moving.
You think President Ghani is here primarily because of that? He's been saying this. He's been talking about...
I think President Ghani is here because he wants to stay in
Raqqa
power.
process, he's been talking about the fact that you can either use Afghanistan as a roundabout.
Which is a terrible term, by the way. The roundabout means you don't go through the place. You just go around it. And that's exactly what the world is doing. You actually need to go through Afghanistan.
No, he meant it metaphorically in a different way,
Sure.
but you got a point there.
Sure. And so what is happening is a roundabout. You actually need to connect it. Now, maybe it's the underpasses that they require. The issue is this connectivity can happen in two ways. There is a China-Pakistan economic corridor that should be extended to Afghanistan.
Yeah.
There should be American investment, there should be European investment, Japanese investment, Pakistani investment, Chinese investment. Everybody then has an interest in keeping that going. Rather than great power competition, you make it a melting pot. Second, it could be East-West. East-West cannot happen till India-Pakistan relations improve. I don't see any appetite in India right now to do that. Right? So as a starting point, it is this North-South CPEC corridor that needs to extend. Then you need to lay that over.
But the Afghans wanted to go west-east also,
Okay, so
overland from Pakistan.
correct. And there are two
They've
different...
been constantly talking about it.
Correct. And so at the end of the day, I think you've got to answer two questions. Whatever deal you strike, the groups that Shamshad Saab had invited, how many of those are going to be part of it? How many of those are going to boycott it? If the majority is going to boycott it, it won't hold. Second, you've got to agree on how to sustain Afghanistan's economy. And the only way I see the most critical player there for Afghanistan is Pakistan. Just geography demands that and dictates that. The other possible important player has been neutralized completely, that's Iran. So at this point, I just don't see, I think President Ghani is very, very smart to come here, because at the end of the day, if Afghanistan has to sustain peacefully, it has to be a Pakistan-Afghanistan arrangement. This idea that Pakistan can be isolated, I had never understood it from day one, right? Now I think that conversation is over, people understand it's just about how do you get there is the question. But stop talking about the deal. There is no deal that the next day you will find Afghanistan becoming Denmark. That's not going to happen.
No, nobody's talking about Afghanistan becoming Denmark, but we're talking about some kind of arrangement where violence ends and where there's some kind of political arrangement.
Wrong metric. See, there is violence. Yeah. US and Taliban agree no violence from tomorrow. US will leave in 5 days. If I'm the insurgent, I will wait 6 days. And then I will take care of any other opposition that comes in the way. That's not sustainable. If you're the Afghan government, and you're thinking, I'm making this up, but you're thinking, let's get them in the system, and then we'll neutralize them later. It won't work. You have to have an arrangement in which both agree, neither is going to win this completely, and whatever we agree to will be lasting.
But
that won't hold if you don't have money.
But Shamshad, that's not going to happen. I mean, you see, here's the catch-22. So on the one hand, the US needs to leave. On the other hand, the moment that happens, within Afghanistan, you get a situation where the Taliban are going to actually have the ANSF for their lunch.
That's a very clear scenario, Ejaz, that one can anticipate, because in the context of the Afghan situation. Taliban, I can understand that they are now holding out because of their insistence that the US must withdraw first. Yeah. Actually, this has been their consistent position for a long time. I remember in the 90s, I visited Afghanistan and had several hours of interaction with the Taliban leadership, trying to persuade them for a broad-based government. And the main point that I was trying to persuade them was ceasefire. They did not agree.
Against the then Northern Alliance?
Yes, they did not agree. So things did not move. But now the situation has changed. So let's hope that sanity will prevail. And here, of course, the United States also will have to play its role, because now, of course, they have their election next year. So that is another important factor which will shape up the Afghan prospects. As regards other Afghan groups, the impression that we got after this event was that they all want peace in Afghanistan. They are fed up with this crisis.
Is very, very apt, that this whole thing about exhaustion. Nobody came and asked, I mean, when the Taliban were fighting and subjugating, they didn't ask the average Afghan. When the Americans came in, they didn't ask the average Afghan. The average Afghan simply is like, you know, it's like if I were to quote that famous line from King Lear, that as flies to wanton boys and we to gods, they kill us for their sport. So there are these big actors. And I think if there is a mission creep, it's on the US side. Would you agree with that?
Well, I mean, yeah, you can go back in history and start looking, and hindsight is 2020, and this sort of nation-building, nationalism, redefined project. Of course, I mean, it's clear that maybe that was a stretch. You know, but we are where we are. We're not going to reverse that. And I think the dilemma, quite frankly, at this point I agree with. Everybody wants some peace deal.
Yeah.
There's no question about that.
Yeah, but what kind of peace deal?
Exactly.
What are the terms?
That's where it keeps breaking down. Now, we are at a much better place than we were a year and a half ago, definitely. There's been progress. There have been draft agreements which have gone back and forth. That's how negotiations happen, right? The other important thing to keep in mind is that I think Pakistan has maxed out on its role.
Oh, it has?
Look, we started from a point where the conversation was Pakistan's not doing anything negative, etc. Now, clearly, we're at a point where we say, yes, Pakistan has done things. But I think now the line that Pakistan took throughout has actually become the conversation, which is There's not much more that can be done. If the Taliban were not listening when they were in power, but Pakistan had much more clout, they were completely isolated, I thought it was always, exaggerated to say that Pakistan can actually force them. And that's the Pakistani sort of argument. The issue now is, if Pakistan can't, if they are not budging on the conversation with President Ghani, they don't want to talk to him, then it leaves the US and Taliban again. And so you go back to the same question. How much compromise on what side will actually get you to a deal? The problem is, if one of those sides wants to leave, then the incentive is the dotted line. The incentive is not anything
No, but
else.
I'm actually stuck on what you said, because, and I think that's a very important point. I get a sense, let me just put it like this. I don't understand President Trump in the sense that he says he wants to get out of Afghanistan, wants to get out of Syria. Then he ratchets up the rhetoric against Iran, which, if there were any miscalculation, is going to that's going to be a game changer. So we wouldn't be talking about Afghanistan anymore.
Yeah.
So what exactly is it that he wants to achieve?
In Afghanistan?
In Afghanistan. He wants to withdraw the troops.
That's what he said publicly.
And since he is totally transactional, keeps talking about money, there's a lot of US money in Afghanistan. I mean, outside of, I think probably it's just 9% of their entire budget that they get from their own revenues. The rest of it is, foreign funding. If he pulls the plug on that, then I think the space is open for the Taliban. With unemployment, with various other
Look,
stuff.
I think if you look at how these things have been approached, first of all, I don't think it's pretty clear President Trump is not the one who wanted to go into Iran and create the next war. But I think if you look at everything that's happened, one, no analysis is needed. His own speech in August, when he announced the policy, was that I don't want to do this, but I've been persuaded, right?
Yeah.
Which is where the timeline idea comes from, that his patience will run out. But his policy is very simple to my mind, which is my homeland should not get affected negatively. Outside of that, I'm not the chieftain and the sheriff of the world anymore.
So this is no more the neoliberal order.
If I don't get 9/11, that's my concern, ultimately.
So essentially, what he's saying is that if you don't hurt me, if you remain within Afghanistan, and you keep killing each other, that's not my concern.
Well, I think that's too crude. But the point basically is the policy conversation would be nation-building project in Afghanistan, how far have we gotten, how much have we achieved, how much is left, and how can we get there? Versus, what is it that's going to hurt me from here? Solve that part of it and deal with the rest separately. I want to understand what's going to hurt me. So the conversation probably would be much more about IS, Islamic State in Khorasan province kind of business, or if Al-Qaeda can re-attack the West or whatever. That probably is a much more prominent conversation in his mind than the fact of how many health clinics and how many schools and whatever else there is. Because in the grand scheme of things, I think that argument cannot be made anymore. Nobody is making that argument, that Afghanistan really matters. That conversation is over. It's really about what this means for the larger piece of it.
Finally, before I wrap up, Shamshad Sahab, since you also work on connectivity, Moeed talked about the options. Either you make this into a melting pot, or of course you have all the walls up. Now, what we see, and I kind of silently chuckled when he talked about melting pot, because I know he's a neorealist, as am I. So I look at the emerging power of China and the fact that there's going to be competition between an emerging power and the existing power. So this whole melting pot business is quite unlikely to work. So your work on connectivity, is it just about the China-Pakistan thing, or does this also involve other regional countries?
Before I answer this question, let me just add on the Afghan subject also that the whole process of Afghan peace, which is now going on at different levels, is very uncertain. The best thing would have been another Geneva, as you talked about before. In fact, about 2014, I was trying to advocate the need for another UN-sponsored peace process in Afghanistan, which could lead to something on the lines of the Congress of Vienna in 1815, so that the world could celebrate Afghan peace and some kind of arrangement of neutrality, Afghan neutrality, just as they were able to do in Europe. So still I'm leaving this thought that perhaps we may have to go to the United Nations for a structured peace in Afghanistan, because otherwise we are lost in the wilderness in the Afghan scenario. Coming back to your question, I have been interacting on this aspect. I think Chinese are very clear. China-Pakistan economic corridor itself will contribute to converting the Pakistan-Afghanistan border into an economic gateway into Central Asia and Afghanistan. So the Chinese are very clear about it. And in fact, the Chinese have some interesting ideas even beyond that, which I cannot share with you at this time. But because after I organized a large roundtable with the Chinese ambassador here last year, they invited me to China. So I spent about 2 weeks discussing with them various aspects of the CPEC and the BRI initiative. So the thoughts that I gathered from there, they were very interesting.
They were interesting. We'll have to do another program for that.
Absolutely.
Because I've run out of time. Thank you, Dr. Moeed Yusuf, Ambassador Shamshad Ahmad Khan. This is all for this week. We shall see you next week at Indus Special. Until then, it's goodbye.